The Magnolia Media Podcast is brought to you by RHR Productions.
Senator have been repeated by neo-Nazis.
Kristen, I hear you saying that they're baseless, but I'm not repeating them because I invented them out of thin air. I'm repeating them because my constituents are saying these things are happening. I mean,
but there's
just
no
yesterday,
evidence.
A video came out of a migrant 30 miles away eating a cat. Clearly, these rumors are out there because constituents are seeing it with their own eyes, and some of them are talking about it. Now, look, we also have to talk about and should primarily talk about the effects that this has had on car insurance rates, on disease rates. Those are the things that I'm spending 95% of my time talking about, Kristen. But again, the media didn't care about this story until we started sharing the 911 call about the geese. That is an indictment of the American media. But the real problem here, Kristen, let me just finish this point, is Kamala Harris opened the border with no plan for how to assimilate 20,000 people. It's made the community worse off. That's what we should be focused on.
Senator, I have to say, though, that the mayor from Dayton in that video that you're talking about and police chief responded forcefully to that new video you just referenced. They say there's absolutely no evidence to even remotely suggest.
And welcome back to the Magnolia Media Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. And you heard in that clip J.D. Vance openly lying again after admitting, well, he would lie on cue if he thought it would help his campaign. He's obviously put it into the context of, well, I'll lie to draw attention to this or to that. But what they really want to do is talk about immigration, because immigration is now the only place where they have an advantage over Vice President Kamala Harris. Even the economy, which had been a strong point for Dementia J, convicted felon Trump, and that has evaporated. Kamala Harris now leads him 44-42. And today we are going to talk about polls. All things polls, all things data, today on the Magnolia Media Podcast. We're going to start with CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and the New York Times. They are still producing polls that are created to keep people guessing, to keep people thinking that this is somehow still, a close race. When national polls done by, anybody other than the hard right-wing New York Times or Axios shows an entirely different story. New polls show Harris is pulling away. In fact, she is within the margin of error in Texas, Florida, and Iowa. Yet, corporate media still wants us to believe this is somehow a really close race. Now, having said that, we need to keep our foot on the gas pedal. We need to keep pitching our message as Democrats to, even Republicans, because we have built a coalition, or we are in the process of building a coalition that includes moderate Republicans. There's not that much difference between a moderate Republican and a moderate Democrat. But we want people who believe in climate change, who believe in helping the working and middle class in this country. Now, when it comes down to killing the filibuster, having to expand the Supreme Court, having to fix the ills that really, really hurt America, it's going to take all Democrats. That's why it's so vitally important that we hold on to the United States Senate. We are all but guaranteed to win the House, given that Republicans only have a 4-seat majority, and frankly, just winning those districts back in Long Island would be enough for Democrats to regain control of the House of Representatives. That way, on January 6th, there won't be any shenanigans by the former Speaker of the House. At that point, he'll be the former Speaker of the House, MAGA Mike Johnson, a man who has no respect for the Constitution and instead prefers his book of fairy tales, also known as the Bible. I had mentioned yesterday in our podcast, when we were graced with the presence of Miss Courtney Brown, that we would be covering religion on today's podcast, but we're going to have to push that off. That's going to have to be a podcast for another day, because there's just too much misleading information out there, especially on corporate media. Harris's lead in Michigan is said to be 5 points. However, when one looks at the makeup of Michigan, including the fact recently Michigan just flipped its House and Senate to Democrats for the first time in 50 years. They have 2 Democratic senators, a Democratic attorney general, lieutenant governor, and governor. That's going to be somewhere between 6 and 9 point win for Kamala Harris, as long as Democrats get out and actually vote. The same poll shows her with a 1 point lead in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a bluer state than Pennsylvania, and she has a 2 point lead in Pennsylvania. 2 points in Pennsylvania is massive, considering the number of counties in that state that I illustrated on my Instagram account that are very small. They have low voter turnout, but they are deeply, deeply conservative, and even conservative to the point where they would vote for Donald Trump, despite the fact he is anything but conservative. They are tied to religion, and frankly, they are old, with the average age in those deep red counties being basically 45 years of age. 45 years old for a median age is old. That means they're celebrating fewer weddings and mourning more funerals. And that will be the trend for the foreseeable future. A close friend of mine purchased a house, a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in one of those small red counties that needed a minimal facelift in order to be livable for $37,000. You heard that right. A house in 2023 for $37,000. Now, as we pull back just a little bit and take a look at what these polls are telling us, in Wisconsin, the poll of polls has her up 1.6%. And that reminds us of Chief Justice of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, Janet Protasewicz. If you remember, in exit polls, that means polling people as they leave the polling location, the far left candidate, Judge Janet Protasewicz, was losing, according to the pollsters, by roughly 2%. But at the end of the day, she won by 11%. In other words, these pollsters can make polls say anything they want. When they're giving you raw data, the polls like Morning Consult, even ActiVote from time to time, or Emerson College sometimes, although it tends to be a bit of a right-wing poll. Marquette University Law, that's another excellent poll. And they're the ones who are going to give you an idea of who has the momentum, of the trend. It's not going to give you the exact number. They're never going to be exact. But we have partisan players pretending to be nonpartisan players, like the Harris poll, which used to be the Harvard Harris poll until university journalists decided to revolt against the Harris poll and demand Harvard detach itself from a polling firm whose math simply does not add up. And speaking of math not adding up, let's jump right in to the New York Times. The New York Times seeing a poll. It was less than a week ago when they showed a poll that was a national poll, and in which Donald Trump led Kamala Harris 49-48. Very much an outlier. And also suggests that Donald Trump was poised to win the popular vote. A Republican hasn't won the popular vote since 2004, and that was on the heels of 9/11, when that was still fresh in everyone's mind, and people weren't thinking at all when they reelected the second most catastrophic president in our lifetime, George W. Bush, a man who exploded deficits, a man who, well, took his eye off the ball. He tore down the Bin Laden Commission, and 8 months later, Bin Laden struck the United States, killing 2,970 plus Americans in New York City, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., when 3 planes were hijacked. He may have taken credit for striking back against the bad guys, but who was it that took their eye off the ball in the first place and allowed the bad guys to attack? I'll leave you with that question for a moment as we move forward with these polls. Now, again, Harris leads Trump by 2 in Pennsylvania, and that's about as big a lead as anyone's going to get in the state of Pennsylvania, because you only have Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, Philadelphia, Westchester County, Erie, Harrisburg, and State College. Those are your blue centers. Those are the places where you're going to find moderates. The rest of the state, well, it's a hard right-wing state once you get into the heartland of Pennsylvania. In fact, yesterday I showed you that graphic of median income that I really didn't include because I didn't want to really wave that in the face of people who are stuck living in that part of Pennsylvania. And don't get me wrong, Pittsburgh is an absolutely fantastic city. Beautiful downtown. It almost looks like it's been set up for a movie scene, like parts of Manhattan. Philadelphia, on the other hand, does have a crime problem and is the poorest of the 6 largest cities in America, which it ranks 6th. It's a very, very big city with a lot of complex problems. We really have to focus on those formerly Republican white housewives or working women who live in Westchester County. Forgive me for using the term housewife, because I know, as do most of you, that women have really, really done well in the last decade or two and have surpassed men in many, many ways. And in those upper middle class households in Westchester County, Pennsylvania, it's almost a certainty that both husband and wife, or wife and wife, have excellent jobs and make a wonderful income. That helps their children, that helps their relatives, that helps their parents prosper well into adulthood or into their elder years. But these legacy news outlets have a vested interest, especially those big corporate names we all know like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, in making sure that this remains a very, very close race. Now, of course, Fox is pure propaganda, and if Donald Trump had a 5 or 6 point lead nationally, it would be game over. They would be riding their high horse and talking about it nonstop. But they operate a little differently over at Fox News because we all know it's essentially a propaganda station. They do no real journalism over on Fox News. Maria Bartiromo or Jesse the Pervert Waters, or at least the man they used to send around to harass women who were filing complaints against Bill O'Reilly. Yes, that's where Jesse Waters got his start. Further harassing those who have been sexually harassed by his former boss, Bill O'Reilly, who now works for News Nation. The news network no one watches, but features people like Chris Cuomo and Bill O'Reilly. And perhaps that's the reason no one pays any attention to them. Because these right-wingers, yes, Chris Cuomo is a right-winger, especially after what happened to his brother Andrew Cuomo in New York State, and was then summarily fired by CNN. This is a collection of miscreants who have been fired by every major news outlet in the country. So they went where all TV news journalists go to die. News Nation. Back to the polls. Outside of the Midwest, Nevada has swung wildly from a 10 to 12 point lead for Trump over Biden to now a 1 percentage point lead for Kamala Harris. Now, if you look at the Senate poll in that state, Jackie Rosen, the Democrat, is up by double digits, just like Ruben Gallego in Arizona. So, while the political pundits might say, well, it's a 1 or 2% point lead for the presidential candidate, wait, guys, slow down a second. Take a deep breath. The Democratic Senate candidate in those states are running away from their Republican adversaries. And yes, they're adversaries because they take an adversarial position. Again, you heard yesterday here on the program and again at the beginning of this program that people like J.D. Vance will lie just to lie if it draws attention to topics that favor them, like the border, which Trump still has about a 12% favorability advantage over Kamala Harris. He's lost the economy, so now it's just immigration all day, every day, and geese and dogs and cats being eaten by Haitian immigrants. They do not care how much harm they cause any community, especially a community that has 10 to 15,000 Haitian migrants. Haitian migrants who are being praised by local leaders for their work ethic and the boost they've given to an otherwise dying town. A town situated firmly in the Rust Belt in a state that is losing population faster than almost any other state in the nation. By the way, the only polls that show a close race are those that are paid for by corporate media. CNN, CBS, and especially the goddamn New York Times. The New York Times has really lost its way. And if the New York Times ceased to exist tomorrow, politically, this would be a better country. Because, frankly, they're misleading. Like when they published that poll, the 49-48 national poll, somehow concluding that Donald Trump was not only going to win the election, but he was going to win the popular vote. New York Times, do better. If you subscribe to the New York Times, skip ahead to the lifestyle section, or what's left of the sports section if they even have one, because paying attention to their political coverage is going to do nothing but leave you hating Peter Baker almost as much as I do. Now, due to the lead Democrats and Democratic senators have in those Sun Belt states, one could surmise that Kamala Harris will likely win Arizona by a much larger margin than did Joe Biden, especially with her McCain coalition, and the fact Kari Lake is on the ballot once again. Kari Lake and Donald Trump turn voters off. Now, they appeal, and they appeal widely, to that 25 to 30% of the electorate, or the roughly 43% who are actually willing to vote for these whack jobs. But I digress. Another major data point has to be Trump's strength in polls that ask, quote, who do you trust more on the economy? I touched on this earlier. However, that lead has not only evaporated, but it has completely disappeared, and Kamala Harris now leads 44 to 42. Axios, yes, Axios, the extreme right-wing online news outlet, says that Harris has a 14-point lead with women and Trump has a 5-point lead among men. However, just a couple hours before recording this, Dana Bash on CNN quoted a whole different set of numbers, and I'm not sure where she got them. She says, and again, without citing a poll, that Kamala Harris has a 12-point lead among women, and Donald Trump has a 14-point lead among men. So 12-point lead among women for Kamala Harris and a 14-point lead among men for Donald Trump. It gets exhausting sometimes having to correct the people who have been entrusted to give us the real, raw, and fair numbers. Kamala Harris is destroying Donald Trump when it comes to the gender gap, and she's launching a $10 million ad buy to get more men on board. In fact, she may erase Donald Trump's lead with men altogether, considering it's only 5 points. And she's leading by between 18 and 20 percentage points with women. And again, this is from Axios. I guess Axios wasn't right-wing enough for CNN. Again, I want to preface all of these comments by saying, pay no attention to these polls other than to get some idea of which way the wind is blowing. Keep your foot on the gas and get out and vote. Make sure your friends are registered to vote. Make sure you are registered to vote. Make a plan for how you're going to vote, whether you vote early, vote by mail, or vote in person. If you're in a red state, I would recommend voting in person because they are purging voter rolls all over the country in red states. And they'll do all they can to throw out ballots that they know were cast by non-white voters, especially in states like Georgia, which has a long history of purging voter rolls for no reason whatsoever other than political gain. Now, we've talked in this podcast about how poorly men are doing in this country. Men, frankly, are failing, especially young men. Among Generation Z, Kamala Harris only has a 3% lead among men in Generation Z, or Gen Z, whatever the kids are calling it these days. But she has a 38 percentage point lead among women. And I don't believe very many Gen Z men are going to vote anyway. They're too busy playing on their phones, playing online video games, and watching pornography to be bothered with something like their civic duty to get out and vote. They're also inundated with right-wing media from people and podcasters like Theo Vaughn, Joe Rogan, and of course the Trump sycophants like Charlie Kirk and the other Russian assets working in the United States. But despite these numbers, Trump had a 14-point lead among men at one point. Kamala Harris has managed to cut into that by 9 percentage points. And again, if she continues on this route, she'll end up winning every major demographic out there. So when I look at a 5-point lead in Michigan, I see 8 points, knowing that Michigan is a blue state from top to bottom. When I see a 1.6 percentage point lead in Wisconsin, I immediately think to the Chief Justice Supreme Court race that happened there a little under 2 years ago, when Judge Janet Protasewicz won by double digits. And she is far, far to the left. Not a moderate Democrat, more of a Bernie Sanders Democrat. One who scared the state legislature so much they were going to try and impeach her before she ever put on the robe. The day has come when a dwindling audience has made CNN as unreliable as Fox News. And MSNBC, well, let's just say MSNBC has more Republican hosts, especially in their primetime lineup early in the morning and then again in the afternoon and evening with Nicole Wallace, Joe Scarborough, than it does Democrats. And it's supposed to be the, quote, liberal network that's fucking with Fox, end quote. They have been anything but that. In fact, they've tried to outright wing Fox News. And these polls that keep coming in that are sponsored by corporations, and every one of these news organizations has a corporation that owns it. They're being traded around like nickels and dimes. They really mean nothing to the corporations that own them, other than they have, cheap advertising to the 50% of people who still have cable. And they know that more and more people are cutting the cord. And where are they going instead? Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, we talked about the 38-point lead among women in the Gen Z category and the 3% lead that she has among young men. Again, this is a generation that's probably going to see the starkest contrast between the success of women and the lack of success of men, if that makes any sense at all. As that ever-shrinking 5-point lead Trump has built among men, it looks very vulnerable, as Harris is looking more and more like the presidential candidate of the two people running for president. Trump is doubling down and tripling down and quadrupling down on dogs and cats being eaten in Springfield, Ohio. What really makes this disgusting is that it has caused a city to basically freeze as bomb threats come in left and right, as wackos come in from other states and from rural parts of Ohio to threaten and possibly eventually attack Haitian immigrants who are doing nothing except boosting that population in Springfield, Ohio. The working jobs that, frankly, Americans that were already here wouldn't work, like working on the kill floor at meatpacking plants. A very unpleasant job, unless, of course, you're from a third world country. And comments like J.D. Vance saying, if you import the third world into your country, you'll become a third world country as a result. That is the biggest line of bullshit I have ever heard. J.D. Vance does not care for his own constituents. And I hope Tim Ryan challenges him in his next senatorial campaign, and they can use all of this, because Donald Trump will be long gone by then, and they can use all of this video that they have from the 2024 election cycle to put J.D. Vance out of politics altogether. I don't know. Maybe Pete Thiel has a special job all lined up for J.D. Vance when his political career comes to a sudden end in his, early 40s? That's where we are. So, as I said, we're going to cover polls, and we will get to that currently. But first of all, let's talk about where news consumers are going. They're streaming. They are streaming, and they're going to streaming news services because they're not having their leg pulled, because they don't both sides every issue to death. They don't have to find some correlation between what a Democrat does and what a Republican does, because there is no comparison. As Republicans, for the most part, with the exception of a few who are retiring or who have already been run out of office because of primaries, believe in democracy. Democrats believe in democracy. They believe in our system. They believe that we do better trying to repair and better the nation we already have. The country we were all led to believe was great when we were children. And it is a great country. It is the best system going. But we have to fix a few things, like crony capitalism, like a $7.25 per hour minimum wage. We have to fix these things. We have to make sure food prices aren't being gouged by big corporations like Smithfield that make sure bacon is super expensive, because goodness gracious, have we heard enough about bacon from a man who has bacon grease on his face 24 hours a day in Donald Trump. And if it's not bacon grease, it's the grease from a quarter pounder. So if you want to find real media, and you want to go to a streaming site, or you want to listen to a podcast like, I don't know, ours, the Magnolia Media Podcast, you could look to Midas Touch, which is approaching 4 million subscribers. Videos by activists like Brian Tyler Cohen, whose videos have been viewed billions of times. And now, just to name a couple that are legacy news outlets, but do a very, very good job, the FT, the Financial Times, does away with all of the fodder and gives you straight numbers. Even Bloomberg would fall into that category to some extent because, well, former Mayor Bloomberg's a billionaire and he is the corporation that runs the news department. So their journalism is fairly good. There's also Semaphore, there's Reuters, there's Vanity Fair, which may be the best of all of them. Molly Jong-Fast at Vanity Fair really doesn't pull any punches, and there's no reason for these outlets, which are only growing, to rig numbers to make elections look closer than they really are, so that people will keep tuning in, desperate for more information, desperate to hear what they want to hear, that their candidate, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, has a real chance. It's nonsense. It's absolutely laughable. You also have real hardcore journalism being done by outlets like Democracy Now! And as Democrats, they might piss you off ever so often because they don't care about party affiliation. They have a set of principles and they go out to pursue those principles. Amy Goodman and Noreen Sheikh, well, they do an excellent job of digging and finding the truth. In fact, they are the only news outlet that has done any reporting about the world's last colony in Western Sahara, which of course is being run by the Moroccan regime. As we move on down the list, we'll find The Observer, The Guardian, which I believe The Observer is a spinoff of The Guardian. These are British papers, but they are still far more reliable than the legacy media we have here in the United States. And as television begins to, well, die, especially anything that's not a live sporting event, we'll have to start looking for good, solid news sources. There's also Substack. You can read some excellent journalistic pieces by people who know what they're talking about on Substack. The same goes for Glenn Kirshner, who doesn't have near the audience of, say, Midas Touch or Brian Tyler Cohen or even David Pakman, but as a 33-year federal prosecutor and a JAG officer before that, the man is literally a legal encyclopedia and can catch you up on everything law and politics. Now, he's not someone who specializes in politics. He's someone who specializes in the law. And he has been on the side of the American people as a prosecutor for over 40 years. So his advice and what he has to say is part of my daily media diet. I listen to his daily Justice Matters podcast. Again, a very, very solid source. A man who knows what he's talking about. But watching these incoherent corporate news outlets gets, well, tiresome. For example, yesterday, 538's poll of polls showed Kamala Harris with a solid 3 percentage point lead. That's in all of the polls. That's not singling out the polls where she has a 4 to 8 point lead. However, today it was 2.8%, and I thought, what changed? And then I saw that the New York Times Siena College poll had been released. And of course, it shows a 1 or 2 point race. It even shows Donald Trump in the lead. We're talking about a national poll. That's suggesting that Donald Trump, again, is going to win the popular vote. I've said that at least 3 times during this podcast, and we all know that's absolutely ridiculous unless Donald Trump's going to win California and New York, which he will not. We all know that. It's not even close. And there are really good journalists out there, like the student journalist at Harvard who got the Harris X poll separated from the university because its polling methodology was so bad. They warned about attaching their name to something so unreliable. So let's take a look at the polls released today or yesterday. We'll start with Florida Atlantic, and this is likely voters. Harris 49, Trump 45. That's outside the margin of error. It's always suspicious to me when they say the margin of error is plus or minus 2.7% and then show Kamala Harris up 5 points in Michigan and go on to say, but that's within the margin of error. Huh? The margin of error is 2.7%. You take that away, she's still up by 2.3 points. Anyway, I digress. Florida Atlantic University a second time. Same result. 49-45. Likely voters. YouGov. Registered voters. Harris 49, Trump 45, Stein 1%, West 0. Activote. Likely voters. 53-47. A 6-point lead for Kamala Harris. Then I'm going to flag this one because it's an outlier, and it's Harris X. Once again, Harris 50, Trump 45, and somehow, some which way, Cornel West supposedly has 3% of the vote. He registers at less than 1% in every other poll except for Harris X, where he gets 3%, and Jill Stein, Moscow's favorite candidate, is at 2%. In a head-to-head matchup, Harris X has Trump losing to Harris 51-49. So just a 2-point spread, despite the fact every other poll shows a 4 to 8 point lead for Kamala Harris with or without the third party candidates. Again, Cornel West running to pay off some tax debt, which is pathetic. And I had noticed in the little bit that I had listened and watched Democracy Now!, Brother West, well, he has been removed from their coverage. And I say that because Cornel West calls everyone brother or sister, like Brother Trump. Well, Brother Trump obviously lined your pockets and took care of your tax debt to get you run as a stalking horse to pull some votes away from Kamala Harris. He did the same thing with RFK Jr., only RFK Jr. was taking votes almost strictly from Donald Trump. So he dropped out and endorsed Trump, which that human phlegm ball that is RFK Jr. probably did more to hurt Donald Trump than he did to help. Let's just take a moment to think about this. The American people, when it comes to politics and news, are being betrayed by one of the most important newspapers and news outlets in the country, one that has existed for a long, long time. And I suppose they believe that there can't be a world in which the New York Times doesn't exist, or a world where CNN doesn't exist, despite the fact CNN really didn't get its footing until the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, it took a war, the first televised war, the first Gulf War, where CNN got access and, well, they sort of exploded after that. But from its inception, circa 1979, 1980, until 1989 or 1990, it was kind of a joke. NBC, CBS, and ABC sort of ran the gambit. And when I speak on legacy corporate media, I will exempt ABC for the moment. George Stephanopoulos is doing as fine a job as any TV journalist out there. They also did an excellent job handling the debate. And David Muir, well, he is certainly the best of what was once the prestigious few who got to host the nightly news. Those 30 minutes from 6:30 to 7 o'clock when the local news cuts to the national news and they give you a quick breakdown of all the stories. Brian Williams didn't work out so well after Tom Brokaw. This is Tom Brokaw. Because of the, lies about being shot at in a helicopter. Yet NBC didn't fire Brian Williams. They just sent it down to their little sister network, MSNBC, which has been treated as the little sister network and a network that is under the corporate thumb of NBC and now Comcast Universal, which I believe owns them at this point. It used to be General Electric, and they kind of have to walk that line because Comcast has contracts with Fox News. So you can't irritate Fox News too much. You'll irritate your parent company, and they'll throw away the, $300 million or so a year they make from MSNBC. But MSNBC has lost its heart. No one there is willing to walk off from those overpriced, bloated salaries that they're being paid. You can't pay someone $25 million a year when you've lost 50% of your viewers. When there are 50% fewer eyeballs watching regular television, cable. People are getting it on TikTok. People are getting it on Threads. They're getting it on Instagram. Unfortunately, they're getting it on Twitter X, which is poison. And I recommend everyone delete the app off your phone. In fact, I think the government's got it all wrong. I believe Twitter X is a bigger threat to the United States and to its population than is TikTok. That's just my opinion. Life improves when you dump X from your phone and keep Elon Musk out of your life. So, the idea that Donald Trump is going to win the popular vote is the position of the New York Times and Siena College poll. They're not doing themselves any favors, especially if Harris ends up winning this thing and pulling out a couple of red states no one expects her to win, which is what I see happening. I do believe she'll win North Carolina. I'm not sure about Georgia. It's not really a swing state. It just, sort of had a swing moment. But North Carolina is certainly trending that way. Kamala Harris has a 1-point lead there. She's back within 2 in Georgia, and she's got it all knotted up in Nevada and Arizona. But again, the strength of those Senate candidates probably means she wins those states by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%. Yes, you heard me say it here. She'll win it by 5 to 6%. This will not be a 10,000 vote election. Not in Arizona, not this time. And in Nevada, we only need one county. That's Clark County. And of course, she got the endorsement of the Service Workers Union, which more or less runs the city, especially when it comes to state politics. So, a quick postscript to the news. Harris doesn't owe legacy media a goddamned thing. She's doing the right thing by avoiding interviews with legacy media that feels they have a right and that they'll keep repeating the same old lie that Americans need to know more about Kamala Harris. Well, all they have to do is turn on the television or pick up their phones and look at all the interviews she's doing. Like the interview she did with the National Association of Black Journalists. If she's not going to get another debate with Donald Trump, another opportunity to gobble him up, another opportunity to drown him, even Joe Rogan was boasting on Kamala Harris and her performance, boasting on her team, and talking about what a disaster it was for Donald Trump. This is a man who has done nothing but platform extreme right-wing propagandists, although he has had people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and, Tom Segura happened to be the guest when they had this conversation, which if you have Instagram or TikTok, you've probably seen the reel at this point. Doing those local interviews in cities like Philadelphia, on local news media, in Pittsburgh, in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, in Madison, in Las Vegas, in Phoenix, in Dallas, Texas, in Houston, in Miami, Florida. Why not? In Atlanta. And of course, her plan to cut down on the margins in those red counties in southern Georgia by visiting Savannah is a wonderful idea to make sure she doesn't just win the state by 11,780 votes because she ran up the score in, places like Atlanta, but instead go right into their kitchen, go right into the front door of their house, they being the Republicans, and cutting those 80-20 counties to 65-35 counties, increasing the margin by which she'll win states like Georgia, or going to red parts of North Carolina. Asheville, North Carolina, one of the most liberal cities in the southeastern United States, if not the most liberal city in the southern United States, is surrounded by red counties and red towns. It's one blue dot of about 500,000 people who live in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Absolutely beautiful city, beautiful area. And again, one of the most progressive cities anywhere in the country, trapped by red towns, red counties in every direction. But she can go there and speak to what are her future voters and to try to sway just a handful of Republicans in County X or County Y or places like Boone and Hickory, North Carolina. Cutting those margins just a little bit is enough to put her over the finish line come November. After all, that is the hope, and that's why we're here. Let's see. I would have included Crooked Media and the folks on Pod Save America, Pod Save the World. However, they're insiders. They're going to repeat what they hear or what they read in the New York Times. They're going to play the game the way they had to play it when they were aides for Barack Obama. They don't come with an outsider's perspective. They come with a fixed insider's perspective. And to me, that, well, isn't really news. It's just an opportunity for old Democratic compatriots to get together and tell war stories from their time working on the 2008 and 2012 Obama campaign. They really offer no information of value. Also, I would give a little bit of a break to Jen Psaki, who hosts the Sunday Show on MSNBC. She does a slightly better job and has a slightly longer leash than most everyone else. As for Rachel Maddow, once a very, very brave woman, willing to walk off to defend her principles. Well, those days are long gone. The lifestyle is just too good, especially when you're making Rachel Maddow type money. She knows she'll never make that kind of money again anywhere else, and that starting over from scratch, like Mehdi Hassan with his Zeteo, which, by the way, I highly recommend as a news outlet. They're getting up off the ground, and Zeteo is going to be a fabulous spot to get your news. Also, 414 Media, made up of the serious journalists, 4 of the most serious journalists left over from what was Vice News or Vice Media. So 414, a couple of programs on MSNBC. Those are ABC News, which is doing a very good job, I would say. Then, of course, there's the Midas Touch Network, which doesn't really lean Democrat or Republican one way or the other. They're just bringing you the truth, the unvarnished truth, and they don't both sides every topic because there is no corporate pressure to do so. And then if you just want some red meat because you're a part of the Democratic base, because you're a liberal, and, well, if you're listening to this podcast, you are likely a liberal, then there's Brian Tyler Cohen, who produces some of the best content online, and that's where his 2.8 billion views have come from. I think I filled you in on just about everything I had to say today. I think I filled you in on, well, the inconsistency of polling, and that paying attention to polls done by the New York Times, which used to be very important, really don't matter anymore. In fact, they're probably the least reliable polls of all of them being put out there. Again, they suggested Donald Trump was going to win the popular vote. The math does not work out. And again, Kamala Harris has overtaken Donald Trump on the question of who do you trust to handle the economy. They have one play left, and that's immigration. And if that means getting people killed in the state J.D. Vance is responsible for, so be it. In their mind, so be it. This is all about a power grab. That's all. And J.D. Vance, as we played for you yesterday, will lie. He will lie, and he said he would lie to keep the attention on the topic he wants to talk about, because it's affecting the lives of my constituents. You are affecting the lives of your constituents. You lie to yourself every day when you wake up and look in the mirror applying your eyeliner with that goofy beard. I wear a beard, but if I'm elected to the United States Senate, it's coming off. Too much respect for the institution to run around there looking like a hippie. As for J.D. Vance, that beard is obviously the beard of a man who, well, is a narc. You see J.D. Vance coming, you know right away that's the facial hair of a snitch. So, that does it for me. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Magnolia Media Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our new intro music, by the way. We're going to play it on the way out, too, if you didn't really pay attention at the beginning. And if you enjoyed the content you heard here today, please consider giving $5 at patreon.com/the Magnolia Media Network. Also, once we get to a certain number of donations over on patreon.com, again, it's $5. When we get to a certain number, then we're going to start doing a Friday newsletter just for subscribers. We'll also do some rather rough content. And what I mean is we won't hold back on language or, refrain from pointing fingers too firmly at one side or another. So consider it. Give it some thought. It's $5. It's half the cost of a macchiato at Starbucks to keep progressive media on the air in the southeastern United States. We are taking on all the risk to bring you an aggregate of today's news, of the week's news, as often as we possibly can. Again, you can follow me on my Instagram page at MagnoliaJohn2024. I post daily lives. I try to get one in every morning between 10 and noon. So tune in. We talk about a little bit of everything. It's not just politics. We talk about fashion. We talk about clothes. We talk about cinema, which is probably my second favorite thing, behind debating politics, of course. And well, that does it for me. Again, I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero, with the Magnolia Media Podcast. And until next time, be well, won't you?